Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked, giving you the digest in the week sports news with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Tariq Panja from the New York Times and Martyn Ziegler from the Times. Last week, we were all together at Twickenham on stage at the Leaders' Conference. This week, we're separated by quite a bit of the world, certainly as regards for Tariq, who is out in Brazil.
Boa tarde, good afternoon. Good afternoon, guys. Nice to see your faces. Apologies for the background. We're recording this pretty much in the street here. And can you hear me? Because this is this lady's shouting.
She could always come on. You're down there on Ipanema. You've been
Yeah.
out doing some stuff looking ahead to the World Cup, but also encountering the elections with Bolsonaro against Lula, their race for the presidency going into a second round. And it's not an election that is unaffected by football as well. The fact Bolsonaro has backing of various players like Neymar.
Yeah, this very much feels like a football election in many ways. As you mentioned, there is a bunch of current and former players. You mentioned Neymar there. There was Romario, famous World Cup winner from '94, a bunch of other footballers as well. But the biggest striking thing with Bolsonaro is that all of his supporters have pretty much made the Brazil yellow shirt their own. So at the polling stations across the country, you see these guys dressed in the Brazil football shirt going to vote. I don't think I've seen anything like that before, and that's kind of a cleavage in Brazil.
Is Romario? Surely Romario is not backing Bolsonaro, is he? I thought he was a sort of socialist figure.
I think his politics have been quite flexible since Romario has been a senator here in Brazil for a number of years, and he gave his backing to Bolsonaro a while back. Premier League fans will know Lucas Moura of Tottenham. He's been a big supporter of his as well. So you've got an interesting election here. A guy from the far right, Bolsonaro, against a socialist in Lula who was the president before, but has since been jailed. So it's a pretty extreme election here, and it's also split families. I've noticed here. It's a lot of anger here on one side against the other. And and these football shirts all over the place.
So close to a World Cup when they're going to be unifying behind the national team in Qatar. Is it really creating divisions out there? The fact you've got players being so vocally backing a figure like Bolsonaro.
Yeah, it's a good question. That I was asking about this. It's happened before, like Brazil under the dictatorship in the past. There were people around the 1970 World Cup, for example, talking about the fact that when Brazil gets to the World Cup, they won't be supporting them because that linked to the dictatorship. However, when the ball started rolling, from what I read and what I've seen in the clips, they said, well, you just can't help who you support. And everyone will be backing Brazil, and they're going in as one of the favourites. So whatever people might say beforehand, I think once Brazil get the tournament going, the whole nation will probably be, behind them.
The Brazilian election, second round being on October the 30th, just weeks before the start of the World Cup.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be hell here, like 4 weeks of this. People on Sunday, when the election was held, the first round at least, were saying, let's just hope it's finished in the first round, because the next 4 weeks are going to be dreadful if it goes into this runoff, because the rhetoric between the two has already been quite bad. And now 4 more weeks of this, it's going to be pretty tough here.
And a few weeks before the start of the World Cup, Tariq, I think you've tried to track down one of those people who voted for Qatar to host it back in 2010, the Brazilian FIFA Exco member at the time, Ricardo Teixeira. Any luck on that?
Well, quite unsuccessful, really. I went to the condominium where he lives, a luxurious condominium, you wouldn't be surprised to know, near Sao Conrado Beach, for those who know Rio, one of the most exclusive, most expensive parts of the city. Again, you won't be surprised about that. The doorman said he's travelling at the moment, but I suspect he's not travelling in the United States, where that warrant for his arrest is still outstanding.
Teixeira, one of those former FIFA officials who'd already been banned from the game by the time he was indicted in 2015 by the US Department of Justice. He was found guilty by FIFA of taking bribes linked to South American rights between 2006 and 2012. And yet he was one of these key figures at one time at the heart of world football. All those big decisions when Sepp Blatter was still FIFA president.
Yeah, there are lots of... if you read through all the US Department of Justice indictments. There's lots and lots of stuff about him. There's suggestions that he was given a lot of money by somebody, perhaps, to vote for Qatar. Not the Qatar official bid team, but somebody. And yeah, he's one of the most unpleasant of the FIFA fat cats, I have to say, in my experience.
A lot of the World Cup build-up can often seem quite European dominated, particularly when we talk about fortunes in the Premier League and Champions League. How's it being out there as they sort of generally prepare for the World Cup, fans away from the elections?
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, because it's in November and December, the season here is still on. It's quite a tight league championship here. I think there's 8 rounds to go. Flamengo played unbeaten Internacional, who placed second, I think, Internacional this week. 50,000 in the Maracanã. The club game, like in England and like elsewhere, is taking precedent. Of course, this World Cup will start with just 1 week break. There's not really going to be a build-up to the World Cup, so I don't think there is a sense that the World Cup is around the corner, because everyone's looking at the games that are going on right now.
Yeah, so much of things preparing for the World Cup, so many players obviously anxiously hoping to make squads and also stay fit. But certainly this week in the world of football and the world of sport, we've actually witnessed one of the most horrific incidents ever to happen at a sporting event. The second deadliest disaster at a football stadium of all time happened in Indonesia on Saturday during their league game. It was a game between Arema and Persebaya Surabaya, and there was disorder by fans. The police intervened heavy-handedly, it seemed, firing tear gas, and fans rushed to escape the stadium. And in the crush, at least 131 people at the time of recording have died. Over 400 people are injured. An absolutely horrific incident there in Indonesia.
Yeah, terrible. I think it's worth pointing out that there were only home fans. There were only Arema fans actually in the stadium, because there'd been a ban imposed on away fans. So this wasn't a sort of, fan on fan violence. This was just angry fans targeting some police running onto the pitch, who then responded by firing tear gas very, very quickly and in large quantities, and causing this awful stampede. It's also worth pointing out that in 2001 in Ellis Park in Johannesburg, 45 people died when police fired tear gas. Very similar circumstances. And as a result of that, FIFA sort of made it fairly clear that authorities should not use tear gas inside a stadium. But I guess that was ignored, Rob.
Yeah, and these FIFA guidelines only enforced at FIFA events. This not being a FIFA event, a domestic match in Indonesia, they only serve as a guide in terms of something they should follow. So there's no consequence on that front. But certainly at FIFA events, tear gas shouldn't be used. Although, Tariq, I'm thinking back actually to 2013 when we were there at the Confederations Cup, and there was unrest actually politically related outside the stadiums at the time, and tear gas was actually flowing into the stadiums. But we saw in Paris as well this year at the Champions League final the problems of tear gas and the impact it could have. And perhaps they were just very fortunate in Paris there were not more serious injuries, given the uncertainty of the situation, the fans who feared that they might be crushed, and the unpredictability that the firing of tear gas indiscriminately caused from the French police.
Absolutely. They've been heavily criticised for using it at all, because it just creates such a sort of risk for fan safety, really. So I think we've already had the policeman in charge apologising, admitting mistakes were made. But I just think certainly for any sort of football authorities anywhere in the world, if this doesn't stand as a lesson, then nothing will.
Because also there has been a focus on the fact that they locked a gate that contributed to the crush. We also saw that at the African Cup of Nations in Cameroon in January, when there were deaths there in the crush. Again, it was people outside and gate being locked. so much of the
We've
time
seen
it's
this
about the gates
repeated
and if
issue
they're opened
of
or
the treatment
closed.
of
And
fans
this happened at
globally.
Hillsborough, and
You
obviously in
kind
a
of treat in a
situation where the
way that
fans
you
were blameless and the police
wouldn't
actions
treat
were
other
found
members
to
of
have
society. It's like they
led to
need
that
to be
disaster.
policed in this really aggressive way. Of course, there was that tear gas in Paris at the Champions League final. Martyn, you mentioned the tear gas there. There is a common theme here, and sometimes it's not the fans, it's the policing.
And just to sort of look at the death toll, amongst the dead, 17 children in Indonesia. So it's affected all ages and so many now still receiving treatment. The thing that is striking, the fact there has been consequence, police being removed from their positions, officials leaving their roles as well. So they have actually acted pretty swiftly in Indonesia rather than trying to necessarily cover up, seemingly.
Yeah, unlike what happened at Hillsborough, that's for sure, where it took sort of the best part of 30 years for the actual truth to come out.
And of course, we're still waiting for that report from UEFA into the event of the Champions League final in May. So far, no one's been held responsible for what happened there. The fact no one got injured, seriously injured at the time, is more luck than anything else. But also, guys, there is that long term, for people who are present at these moments, the psychological impact of being a part of this, the mental scars from being present at this type of event. That's something that also needs to be considered years later.
And now there is an issue for FIFA because Indonesia is due to be hosting the Under-20 World Cup next year for men's teams.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. They're not going to have the sort of tribal rivalries that they have with the club game there. So, I guess the risk factor is going to be low. But I imagine FIFA will be making absolutely clear what they expect and their rules around security.
Of course, it is, though, a chance for Indonesia to be hosting a world football event, something that doesn't happen very often. They perhaps aren't going to host a senior World Cup soon. So there could really be intense passion from the fans determined to actually see their team playing. So that really will be a security headache going forward for FIFA and Indonesia. We've been looking ahead to the 2030 World Cup this week as well, because bidding heating up for that race for the Men's World Cup. And we've already talked on the pod previously about that potential three-continent bid with Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Greece. The South American bid as well, featuring
Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Paraguay.
Thanks for a reminder on that. And now the Spain-Portugal bid has Ukraine joining up on board with it. And we're only potentially 2 years out from a vote, and Ukraine's still at war. So you first broke the story. How's this going to transpire, Martyn?
Well, I think there'll be a sort of there'll going to be a minor partner in the bid. For example, like Portugal, I think they've got 3 host stadiums planned. Spain have got 11, and I think the idea Ukraine will have like 1 or 2, and we'll just have one group basically. So they'll probably have 2 stadiums. That's the idea. But it's very much, I think, a tactic to try and hit back at this plan of Saudi Arabia, a Saudi-dominated bid, a sort of very wealthy something perhaps which could potentially get backing from FIFA and 3 confederations. This is sort of Europe's way of trying to get the vote on the sort of football for peace sort of message.
Well, Martyn, hang on. What do you think of that? You said this is a way of Europe to get back at this Saudi Arabian bid. The idea of this country at war being used in this kind of football political way seems a bit grubby in some sense, doesn't it? And also, does it not completely politicize bidding all the way through now? The idea that the UEFA has planted its flag here, country at war. You could see pull on the heartstrings of the voters. This is the right thing to do right now. But it does kind of open Pandora's box a bit, right? Doesn't it?
I know what you mean. So I don't think it wasn't the fact that they were approached. So from what my understanding is, UEFA were approached by Ukraine, the Ukraine FA, saying we want to bid for the World Cup and do it jointly with Poland. And to which UEFA said, hang on a minute, that's not going to work. Spain and Portugal already bidding. They're sort of our favoured choice. But I think maybe sort of people's imagination started working, sort of tick-tock. Oh, now this might be a good thing. And then I think that's how it transpired.
Of course, Sheffirin, the UEFA president, Rob, you published this letter he got from the Ukrainian president Zelensky a couple of weeks ago, and that seemed quite a cozy relationship as well. I was surprised to see at the end of that letter he mentioned in the middle of the war thanking Alexander Seferin for saving football from the ogre that is the European Super League. I found that a bit strange.
He's a big fan keeping watching Champions League matches still rather than a Super League while working on the counter-offensive against Russia.
That letter obviously reflects UEFA's position, I guess, then, Tariq, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there just seems a degree of choreography. I mean, the other funny thing was this press conference was held at UEFA's headquarters, but UEFA saying this has nothing to do with us. We're only lending this group our space. So in all of the places in all of the world where this press conference could have taken place, it was held at UEFA, but it's nothing to do with UEFA.
Graham Dunbar, who's a sort of fairly regular guest on this podcast, he covered it for AP in Geneva in Neon. He was like surprised that Spain and Portugal refused to allow translators in. So that's a strange thing. If you're like trying to appeal to the international an international audience and 211 FIFA member nations, a lot of whom probably speak English as a second language at least. A bit strange that you wouldn't allow translation. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the war is ongoing, and if we think back to 2014 when Russia started to annex Crimea, and that's when the partial invasion began, which led to the full invasion this year. Well, we're now 8 years on from that. We're talking about a World Cup 8 years in the future in 2030. I think what we've seen since 2014 is these situations can drag on. The fact we're still talking about Ukraine trying to regain territory that Russia has annexed from 8 years ago.
Yeah, Rob, that's a really good point. Do you remember, we were at the semi-final of Euro 2012, and that was held in Donetsk, which is now held by Russia. And I mean, that's where we are right now. Who knows what the situation's going to be in 2030? And Martyn, to your point about those translators not being there, if you remember the Spain and Portugal 2018 bid, it was one of the most pitiful bids of all of them. There was hardly any, they didn't make any effort at all, if I remember correctly. There was a little book and maybe one person who was going around representing this bid for the 2018 World Cup. So maybe they think they don't need to do anything because at that time the FIFA voters didn't care what the public offering is going to be. It all happens behind the scenes. Of course, Spain and Russia didn't get the 2018 World Cup, but they did get far more votes than England, didn't they? Who had a very public bid.
Yeah, and more than Belgium, Holland. They got quite a few, didn't they? I think they got 6, but or 7 in the first round. But they were sort of responsible for the most memorable quote of that bidding campaign, which I think was said to you, Tariq, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes. It was. I believe it's to do with fish. All the fish have been sold, Mr. Villar said at the time. The former president of the Spanish FA, talking about the bidding competition, and he was quite right. If you believe the US authorities, the fish were sold, and we're going to Qatar in 2022. We went to Russia in 2018.
All this to look forward to with the 2030 bidding contest, just when we might have thought that the world of football politics was getting a bit dry in recent weeks and months after the sort of biennial World Cup battles faded away. But this bidding contest really is potentially pitting various factions of world football up against each other, the desires perhaps of Gianni Infantino at FIFA and Alexander Seferin at UEFA.
We could do with an interesting one, actually, because the USA... Canada, Mexico was a sort of procession, wasn't it? I mean, I think they were just up against Morocco and that was it. So, yeah, a bit of competition should make things interesting.
Guys, funny enough, there's a bit of a detail here from South America where we don't really look at this region that much. Of course, the next World Cup, Martyn, you mentioned in 2026, is going to be 48 teams. That creates a very boring problem or a problem of boredom here in South America because they only have 10 teams competing for qualification and they're going to get 6.5, probably 7 spots at that World Cup. At the moment, they play 18 games, So the Brazilian Federation is saying they want to reduce the competition to just somehow get it done in 12, not 18, save 6 games so they can join Europe and play in Nations League. But there is a big wrinkle in this plan because some of the smaller federations said, well, you can't because we've already sold our qualification rights for these 18 games in the future before they know what's going on. A very South American problem here.
And a very Barcelona solution as well. They've, of course, sold their rights there for many years down the line as well. And perhaps what Europe has foreseen, because there had been a plan within UEFA at least to expand the Euro from 24 to 32 teams, the men's tournament, but it seems actually it will stick at 24 because they realised, what do you do with qualifying? Qualifying would be pretty dull if you've got 32 out of the 54 teams qualifying.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we'll also, what might be fairly dull in the USA is the actual group stage, because it now looks like they're going to have 4 groups of 4 instead of groups of 3. So, and then a round of 32, and then 16. So huge number of matches to try and avoid this issue of if you only have a group of 3, then there's a potential issue around the last match in the group. There'll be one team not playing, so they're going to have groups of 4 probably. And it just shows going up to 48 teams to me has been a terrible, terrible move, and it's going to be a messy tournament.
Something down the line there for FIFA regarding North America, but far more serious matters affecting football in North America this week, with the investigation into sexual misconduct and emotional abuse in US women's football. The investigation finding issues across the country. We've had 5 out of the 10 coaches in the NWSL being fired or stepping down last season, all amidst misconduct allegations. And we've had the findings of a report from the former acting US Attorney General, Sally Q. Yates. This follows a series of scandals and deep concern across the US women's game.
It's incredible, that number of coaches that have had to step down, isn't it? It's just like remarkable. And the other big issue here, is that there was this thing where coaches would be fired or moved on because of misconduct, but they'd sort of get a glowing reference and just get another job at another club, and the same abusive behaviour would happen there. And this things have been flagged to the US soccer, the league chiefs, but they didn't take any action over it.
Perhaps similar to a scene in the church at times.
Yeah, Rob, that's a really good parallel, where people want to keep their head down and not be the ones to blow the whistle on this, knowing exactly what's happening. And I honestly, looking at some of the reporting in the States, this is a scandal of epic proportions there. My worry is, if you look at federations across the world, we've seen scandals in France, we've seen scandals in Canada, elsewhere. The fact that this investigation was so deep and was carried out so thoroughly, I dread to think what we're going to find if such similar investigations are carried out elsewhere. And I wonder whether FIFA should now be looking closely at doing an audit of the women's game more broadly and in the United States.
One of these coaches involved is an Englishman, Paul Riley. He was dismissed from the North Carolina Courage after 2 former players accused him of sexual coercion and harassment. That was going back a decade. He has denied wrongdoing. He also did coach the Portland Thorns. Well, the president of US Soccer, Cindy Parlow Cone, has been speaking to us here at Sport Unlocked. The investigation highlighted how she experienced an inappropriate comment from a team official while coach herself of the Portland Thorns in 2013. Parlow Cone has been telling us how troubling she found the investigation's findings.
I think the report is shocking and heartbreaking, to care so deeply about the sport, the women's side of the sport, the individual players. It was really hard to read. I couldn't read it in one sitting. I had to take it in chunks and divide it up. And, I think, like many other people, it will take me a long time to really process everything that's actually in the report because it is so devastating.
How were people allowed to get away with this? How are the coaches allowed to? Is that the big question, and also how I suppose within teams, someone could be left alone while another person might be a victim.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that was very obvious in Sally Yates' independent investigation was that this was systemic. This wasn't one coach, one team, one executive. It was systemic throughout the entire NWSL. And so, and you saw in the recommendations of ways that we can work together with the different constituencies across the U.S. soccer landscape or football landscape to really work to implement those changes.
Is it a case that perhaps people turned a blind eye to it? Perhaps at the time the women's game didn't have the resources in terms of administration, so investigations weren't carried out? Is it part of a problem in terms of the growth of the game, the fact that some of the procedures hadn't been as advanced at the time?
Yeah, Sally points out very clearly that it was kind of a rush to get the league up and running, and that likely some steps, very basic HR, was missing. But this is a problem that likely is not isolated, unfortunately, to the NWSL, and it's something that we need to look more broadly at within our sport and also other sports, because, even with some of those recommendations, like if we implement all of them, to think that we're going to root out all levels of abuse, I don't think will happen. But can we make it easier to report? Can we make it safer to report? And I think those answers are yes and yes. And so those are the things there's things we're doing immediately right now to make changes. And then there are things that will take time to implement. And so I think this is going to be a long process. It's not just simply, okay, the report's out, let's turn the page, like we're done. There's a lot of healing that needs to occur, as well as a lot of policy, implementation of policy that needs to happen.
We do hear in other countries sexual harassment, abuse within particularly women's football. Is this a lesson for the rest of the world as well to sort of follow and to check its own procedures?
I would call out for everyone, right? In sports, in women's sports, if you have women working in your company, to make sure that you have a safe working environment for every girl, every woman, or a safe playing environment. And so I think this is kind of a call to action for everyone to make sure that the playing spaces, the workspaces are safe.
In Britain, there's not just in football, but there's been soul searching going on in lots of different sports around this sort of powerful relationships that coaches have over young women, and it can lead to it becomes very, very controlling and in some cases abusive.
One of those people highlighted in the report is Sunil Gulati, who's a former president of US Soccer, and he told the investigators that various surveys that were conducted contained important feedback, but he did not recall the comments specifically from the Thorns players. This is something highlighted in your paper, the New York Times, and he told investigators that he overlooked them because he assumed that Portland was squared away. So some questions for Sunil Gulati, who was leading US Soccer at the time, that a lot of these allegations emerged, although he's not involved himself.
Yeah, Sunil Gulati, now the guy in charge of UEFA's financial fair play panel, isn't he? So he is still involved in football.
Well, this is, of course, really resonating across the whole US team, and perhaps the most famous member is Megan Rapinoe, who's been talking about her shock about what's been going on in the US game.
I mean, it's horrifying. Obviously, I'm sure everybody read the report and have read all the reporting that's been going on the last year. I mean, it's even when you know it, it's just horrifying over and over to read. It's been difficult for the players. Some of those players play in those clubs, have been coached by those coaches, likely have been abused in one form or another by some of those coaches or in some of those environments or different environments, youth environments, whatever it may be. It can definitely be re-triggering or re-traumatizing. And those people are in positions that have responsibilities, and they didn't fulfill those responsibilities. They didn't protect the players at all amidst year after year after year. I feel like it's just like impossible to overstate that every single year someone said something about multiple coaches in the league and about multiple different environments. So if, year after year after year, you cannot perform your duties. I know I wouldn't be in my position if I couldn't perform my duties year after year, much less practice after practice, likely. So it's just, and obviously the horrific consequences that come with them not performing those duties, putting players at risk, putting future players at risk. Obviously, Paul went on and coached, a ton of different players, and kept doing the exact same thing. So it's just unacceptable. Like, you don't get to, it's a privilege to, be in a position around sports or be in one of those positions or to play.
Megan Rapinoe speaking there. Well, moving on to other matters and to the Asian Winter Games, perhaps not a topic we often cover, but they have been awarded for 2029 to a country many might not associate with winter sports.
But with a lot of money, Martyn, correct?
Yes. Surprise, surprise, Saudi Arabia is going to be hosting the 2029 Winter Games. Skiing, snowboarding, ice skating. You may not think Saudi Arabia is a sort of place where you could have skiing, but this is going to be part of the $500 billion NEOM project. Apparently, in the mountainous areas, temperatures kind of get down to zero, but obviously it's going to have to be artificial snow. I mean, I don't know how this is going to work environmentally, but it just sounds like a sort of the ultimate in whatever the opposite of green energy is. How can this possibly work?
The Saudi sports minister talking about the unlimited support of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to the sports sector, allowing this all to be backed and to get this Winter Games off the line.
Speaking of unlimited support, it's also a year since the Saudi takeover of Newcastle. Guys, there was a letter from Yasser Al Rumayyan, the chairman of Newcastle, the chief executive of PIF, the private investment fund today, talking about, the year they've had and their plans for the future. Yeah, it's been a year. No one's been able to see him at a press conference or interview him. What would you ask him?
How is it that there is no control, apparently, of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the running of Newcastle United, given the fact that PIF is chaired by Mohammed bin Salman and most of the board are ministers?
I think that would be a very good question. Right?
Have I taken your question away from you? Now you're scrambling for a second one if he was in front of us.
Second one, well, I don't know, because obviously Yasser Al Rumayyan is also the head of the Saudi Golf Federation, which is involved in the whole Live Golf breakaway competition. So, there might be a good opportunity to grill him on that at the same time.
Particularly as we prepare for what's the final individual event on the Live Golf circuit. That's actually taking place in Saudi Arabia next week in Jeddah. And this all comes at a time when Live Golf has been attempting to gain ranking status, which it has lacked, by linking up with the MENA Tour, a tour many might not have heard of. They haven't actually held competitions for some time, I believe, since before the pandemic. But as it stands now, the official world golf ranking body has said it won't offer ranking points this season, at least, to Live Golf, despite its partnership with the MENA Tour.
I wonder if the fact that Al Rumayyan is also the president of the Asian Golf Federation has anything to do with that that particular arrangement.
I wonder if he likes skiing, Zeeks.
Yes, probably. Maybe he loves golf so much. There's going to be a sort of golf on ice competition at the Asian Winter Games, maybe.
How, though, English rugby might welcome Saudi cash with no questions asked, particularly at the Worcester Warriors, which has been partly liquidated and the players have had their contracts terminated. This is all over an unpaid tax bill of around £6 million, and it has created complete uncertainty in the Premiership.
Yeah, they've been basically kicked out of the Premiership. Worcester Warriors, Wasps, another Premiership club, are possibly going into administration. They've been given more time to pay a tax bill. It just raises the question about how these top rugby clubs have got into this position, because they've had big loans from the government from COVID. I think something like 15 million was given to Worcester. They've had the CVC Capital Partners came and did an investment, and they got a big chunk of cash there. So to me, it just seems like pretty bad management to get into position where you do have this money coming in, yet you're still not cutting your cloth accordingly. Because you can't blame the pandemic, because you've been bailed out of the pandemic. So what's happened here?
Martyn, is there a question to be asked, these guys who came in, is there a question to be asked whether they took advantage of that cash that did come in because of the pandemic? If you kind of get into it, there's a bit of free money coming in as a result of the pandemic, and these people have run the club into the ground. I wonder if the investigators or people looking into this collapse will focus on what they did with the pandemic money, whether they had a business plan or whether they just wanted to take it out of the business.
Well, they absolutely should be doing. And in fact, the government, because it's government money, they've appointed some auditors and administrators to have a look at it. And I'm sure that there will be pressure to find out if public money has been misused. But there have been, we haven't been able to. If you try and look at the accounts are long overdue. So they haven't filed the accounts, so you can't actually see what's happened to this money properly.
And Martyn, it wouldn't be the first time as well. I mean, that's the thing with the pandemic. If it feels such a long time ago now. Now we're kind of back in the real world, but there was so much money poured into all sorts of sectors, to just keep them afloat. Sport being a tiny part of it, but the amount that was sort of siphoned off and taken away, whether it's PPE contracts or whatever else in the UK and elsewhere. I assume the auditors would have a field day if they start looking into where the tens of billions of pounds of public money ended up in the UK.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even on quite small levels. I mean, I've seen evidence of a football agent basically claimed loads of pandemic relief for people working for him. And never pass the money on to them. For example, I think this sort of thing was rife.
And to think of the fact that the Worcester Warriors won the Premiership Rugby Cup just last season, so this was a team really on the up, and now you've got players facing uncertain futures. Some have tried to sort of find new clubs already, but a real sense of how it impacts the players in all this and the many staff members at the club. Well, it's not only in rugby where there's been chaos and uncertainty this week. We've also seen that in boxing as well, with a pretty curious incident over the fight between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn, which they tried to proceed with despite the fact Ben failed a doping test. This was for a female fertility drug that he tested positive for in the last month or so.
The details of this are a bit sort of strange. I mean, it was a voluntary doping test, wasn't it? So it wasn't an official WADA one, but did that still mean that the fight couldn't go ahead?
Well, one of the things was the British Boxing Board of Control withdrew its sanctioning and said that actually it wouldn't approve this bout going ahead. So it could create all sorts of legal consequences if there had been a fight without the official sanctioning of the British Boxing Board of Control.
Well, there are so many boxing boards that are willing to sanction all sorts of things. I think it's a bit of an indictment on the sports. There, you can go forum shopping if you want, like when you try and find a court that will rule in your favour. Boxing has lots of licensing bodies, and there was talk they're going to find a friendly one willing to take this fight on, and this just shines a light again on I guess governance in professional boxing. It's always been a bit of a grey area. You've got all those different organisations as well, haven't you? You've got 4 or 5 different belts, for example, in each weight category. it's just a bit of a mess. So do you think this thing is going to go ahead or not go ahead, Rob? What's the feeling?
Well, it's not due to go ahead this week at the time of recording, and of course this would have been a fight that would have evoked a lot of memories going back 30 years ago, because both of the fighters' fathers, of course, fought back then. They're Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank, and the promoters, Matchroom, did actually try to say that it was all clear to go ahead because Ben's B sample had not been tested, and the fact that he'd recently passed a UCAD doping test. But certainly, at least in this case, we have had the British Boxing Board of Control show their authority and actually take the stance to try to sort of stand up for the sport.
I mean, the thing about boxing, I mean, it's a sport which is all over the shop so often, isn't it? And money talks, doesn't it? And we've had things before when I think Amir Khan was facing Canelo Alvarez in 2018, and Alvarez, I think he tested positive for clenbuterol, and officially he said, "Oh, we should let's fight anyway," because he stood to lose a lot of money, Amir Khan. But obviously it didn't happen. But I think there's so much money at stake that the sort of the proper approach to doping offences, often people try and sweep that away. One more crazy thing to mention on boxing. Umar Kremlev, the president of the IBA, who is Russian, sponsored by Gazprom, the Russian state-owned Russian energy giant, just announced that Russian and Belarusian boxers are going to be allowed back into competition, and this has been welcomed by Vladimir Putin. So no conflicts there.
What's cleaner, boxing or the Brazilian election, as we round up Sport and Lot?
Rob, I don't want to be the one to make a claim on either of those. What's clear is that it provides enough content and enough stuff for us to talk about both of those, boxing and the Brazilian election, I guess.
Well, Tariq, it's great you could find a place in Ipanema to join us on Sport and Lot.
Obrigado, guys. Obrigado, boa noite. Nice to see everyone. Looking forward to seeing you back in Blighty.
Well, as ever, you can hit subscribe and message us at Sport and Lot on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. But for now, thank you for listening, particularly those in Brazil.